Welcome to Lesson 1 of HSE Essentials course. In Lesson 1, I'll be looking at what occupational safety and health is all about. In this lesson, we'll lay a foundation for what you need to know in terms of what the definition of occupational safety and health is all about, and why occupational safety and health is important in the first place, what it means to organizations, and what it also means to individuals. Lesson 1. What is occupational safety and health? In Lesson 1, we'll be attempting to understand what occupational safety and health is and the need for ensuring safety is appropriately managed and implemented in the workplace. It's important for us to understand what safety and health is all about, the definition, in order for us to be able to adequately manage safety and health in the workplace. So let's define occupational safety and health. It is a cross-disciplinary area concerned with protecting the safety, health, and welfare of people engaged in work or employment. While the idea of safety and health cuts across workplaces and our homes, the road, and everywhere that we actually exist, the focus of occupational safety and health professionally is in the workplace. The regulations that guide occupational safety and health also is in the workplace. The roles and the responsibilities, all of these are focused on the workplace and on workers. So the emphasis is on the workplace, even though the principles we're going to be learning also can be applied anywhere, but the emphasis is on workers vis-a-vis the employees, that is employees and employers and the workplace. So the goal of all occupational health and safety programs is to foster a safe work environment. And this usually will involve interaction among many subject areas. So HSE is not limited to the engineering field or to a particular industry. It is cross-disciplinary and it applies to all industries, all places where work is carried out. So it involves interactions among many subject areas, including occupational medicine, safety engineering, chemistry, ergonomics, toxicology, environmental health, industrial relations, public policy, sociology, social law, labor law, and occupational health psychology. All of these knowledge areas come together to form the body of knowledge that constitutes occupational safety and health. And when we consider safety and health, we look at a number of areas that safety and health is focused on. Now, occupational safety and health is aimed at the promotion and maintenance of the highest degree of physical, mental, and social well-being of workers in all occupation. It also includes the prevention among workers of adverse effects on health caused by their working conditions. So occupational safety and health is about promoting the highest degree of physical, mental, and social well-being for workers, preventing workers from adverse health and safety effects caused by their working conditions, protection of the workers in the employment from risks resulting from factors adverse to health, as well as placing the workers in an occupational environment adapted to physical and mental needs and adapting of work to humans. So as a safety professional, your focus will be to promote the highest degree of physical and mental and social well-being of workers, to prevent injuries and adverse health effects, to protect the worker, to place the worker in an ideal physical and mental environment for work to be done, and to ensure that the work is adapted to the human and not vice versa. Occupational safety and health is important because work plays a central role in people's lives. So you find that most people spend a lot of their time at work as against any other place, whether it's at home or on the road or on holidays. We spend most of our time at work. So that means that we must be safe in the places where we work. And that's why it is important that occupational safety and health be taken seriously. We say, therefore, work environments have to be safe and healthy, yet we find that this is not the case for many workers. Every day, workers all over the world are faced with a multitude of safety and health hazards, including dusts, gases, noise, vibration, extreme temperatures. Several things come to bear as hazards, which are things that have the potential to cause harm in the workplace. So that is why the role of occupational safety and health or safety professionals is important in the workplace to ensure the promotion, the placement, the protection of workers in the workplace. Hey, how is the course going so far? You're already in Lesson 2, and it's good that you are continuing on this journey. In Lesson 2, I'll be talking to you about safety paradigm. And the idea behind safety paradigm is for you to know what kind of attitude should your organization or you yourself have towards safety in the workplace to ensure that you make a success of the initiatives that you have in place as far as safety is concerned. Come with me and let's discuss safety paradigm. Lesson 2, safety paradigms. Safety paradigms essentially talks about the appropriate mindset that an organization or an individual, particularly the safety professional, whether you're a worker, you're a supervisor, you're a manager, it's important to have the right perspective towards safety in the workplace. And we have 3 paradigms that we are going to discuss in this class. Remember, paradigm essentially talks about the mindset, or what you may call the worldview. So we have 3 of them: regulatory compliance, financial concern, and ethics, morals, or humanitarian. The key question here is which of these perspectives is most likely to promote the most friendly environment for a good health and safety culture. It's important that in an organization, the safety culture, there's a strong safety culture for safety to work and for lives to be protected. So if the paradigm of the organization or of the safety professional is misplaced or is wrong, then it will be difficult to create and sustain a good health and safety culture that would promote the protection of lives in the work environment. So let's look at these 3 perspectives that an organization may have or that may be predominant in an organization. And it is the job of the safety professional to foster or to promote a correct or the correct safety paradigm to ensure that a good and healthy and strong safety culture is entrenched within the organization. So we have regulatory concern or regulatory compliance. And the idea behind this perspective is that anyone having this perspective is essentially concerned only about regulatory compliance. So everything that is done in the organization is driven by the need to comply with regulations. While this is good, it may not be enough. Then there's a second perspective, which is financial concern. This is the thinking that safety personnel are not hired because the companies were considerate about providing an environment where employees did not get hurt, but that they are hired because it makes good business sense. So the focus is on how do we save money? How do we ensure that we don't overspend? When an organization is driven by financial concerns, then you find a scenario where if it's not going to save money, if it's going to cost too much, then we're not going to do it, even though it may impact on the lives of people. Then there is ethics, morals, or humanitarian. You probably guessed already that this is the best perspective. But here, the focus is on the people. Okay, the focus is on human lives. The thought behind ethics, morals, or humanitarian perspective is that keeping our employees safe is an ethical concern. Any organization that has this mindset is going to be able to create a good health and safety culture, and safety is going to thrive in that organization. So obviously, the best perspective to have is that of humanitarian, morals, or ethics. We see already now that the objective of having safety initiatives in the workplace is not just regulatory compliance, okay? And it is not saving money or, however, it is the avoidance of human injury. This must be the overriding motive for any organization to embark on a safety and health initiative. Ethics should be the basis on which an organization embarks on a safety program. And when that is the basis, then health, safety, and environment initiatives will prosper in that organization. Here in Lesson 3, we'll be discussing the 8 principles of a safe workplace. While these are not universal principles in that sense, they are principles that you and your organization will do well to adhere to in order to ensure that safety works in your organization. I bet you, if you adhere to these principles and you make them a core part of safety in your workplace, you will make a good success of the safety initiatives in the workplace. The 8 principles of a safe workplace in Lesson 3. In this lesson, we'll be talking about occupational safety and health, or health, safety, and environment principles. We'll be discussing 8 principles that guide or that should guide any organization in order for safety to be broadly embraced in the organization for effective implementation of safety initiatives. If you recall, in the last lesson, we talked about safety paradigms. We talked about 3 of them. That is regulatory compliance, financial concerns, and ethics. And we settled for ethics as being the overarching reason why an organization should embark on a safety initiative or a safety program. Now, we're going to be looking at principles that should guide any organization in order for the safety program to actually do well and for them to actually succeed in the safety program. There are 8 of them, and they are principles. Of course, when we talk about principles, we're saying what are those things that should guide how safety is implemented. That is, if these 8 things are in place, if a safety professional or a supervisor understands that these 8 things must be in place within an organization, then safety has a good chance of succeeding in the organization. The first is safety is an ethical responsibility. At its core, ethics holds up a positive vision of what is right and what is good. It defines what is worth pursuing as guidance for our decisions and actions. Workplace injuries and deaths are too often seen in the abstract as statistics, so it is our ethical responsibility to do what is necessary to protect employees from death, injury, and illness in the workplace. This must be the foundation upon which a true safety culture can be established in any workplace. So as a safety professional, you must realize that safety is an ethical responsibility, both for the worker and, of course, particularly for management and for those saddled with the responsibility of ensuring safety in the workplace. It must be done. So that principle is critical. The organization must realize, must accept and embrace the fact that safety is an ethical responsibility. It's not a choice. It's not just because it's mandated by regulation. It is because it is the right thing to do. Second principle is safety is a culture and not a program. Safety is a culture, not a program. The organization must realize that safety goes beyond just writing a set of rules and procedures. It must become part of the way of life of the organization. It is by understanding this principle and working to ensure this happens that an organization will indeed be able to be a safe place for workers. Every person in the organization, from top management to the newest employee, must realize that safety is part of how work is done here, and that they must realize that they're responsible and accountable for preserving the safety, the health of the workers, and also the environment within which they work. Number 3 is management is responsible. In safety, when we talk about management, we're talking about the leadership of the organization. And management's responsibility is to lead the safety effort in a sustained and consistent way, establishing safety goals, demanding accountability for safety performance, and providing the resources necessary for a safe workplace. Managing safety is first and foremost the responsibility of leadership in the organization. First and foremost. Then it goes on to every supervisor, from the first line supervisor, up onto the last person on the shop floor. So managing safety starts from the very top, from the chairman of the board in an organization to the very last person. Everyone is responsible, but first and foremost, it starts from the top. There must be management commitment, and management must realize that it is responsible for safety. Number 4, employees must be trained to work safely. This is the 4th principle. Remember, principles are those guiding things. They guide us. They ensure that we do what is right to get the expected results. So if an organization has these 8 principles in place, the likelihood of succeeding and having a safe work environment is guaranteed. Employees must be trained to work safely. Number 4, awareness of safety does not come naturally to anyone. Everyone needs to be trained to work safely. So effective training programs both teach and motivate employees to be a productive part of the safety culture. So a principle that must be in place in an organization for safety to work is that all employees must be trained to work safely. And you would find that one of the core responsibilities of a safety coordinator, safety supervisor, or safety professional in any organization is actually training, because it's a core principle of effective safety management. The 5th principle we'll discuss is safety is a condition of employment. The employer must exhaust every reasonable means to lead, motivate, and train employees to maintain a safe workplace. But in the event that the employee refuses to take the actions required to work safely, the employer then must utilize a system of progressive discipline to enforce safety requirements and ensure the cooperation of the employee or removal of the employee from the workplace in order to protect the employee and their co-workers. What this is saying essentially is that if safety is going to work within an organization, then it's either people do the work safely or they don't work in that organization. This principle is critical in any organization that safety is going to work in. So it must be established that it's either you work safely or you ship out. So safety must be a condition of employment. Then the 6th principle is all injuries are preventable. This is important. If safety is going to work, the organization and the safety manager must not have a fatalistic view of accidents. That is, thinking that what is going to be, thinking that, well, we can't prevent all accidents, something is going to go wrong at some point. No, we must have the mindset that it is possible, and indeed it is, to prevent all injuries. It is possible to have 0 incidents, 0 accidents. Vision 0 is possible. That's the idea behind all injuries are preventable. There must be the fundamental belief that injuries are, by their nature, preventable, and this will be a catalyst that encourages us to prevent injuries. Number 7, safety programs must be site-specific. The idea behind this, and we're going to discuss this later on when we discuss risk assessment, is that safety programs must be site-specific, and there has to be recurring audits of the workplace and prompt corrective action taken. This is going to be discussed further in the subsequent lessons. However, suffice to know at this point that for safety to work, there must be specific consideration of sites or projects or places of work that people are carrying out different activities, and those places must be looked at, audited, assessed, and the specific controls or specific remedies to what may cause harm in those places must be considered and taken care of. What this means is that safety is not generic. Safety is not the fact that you have created a safety program in one place or in one office or in one location of your business does not mean that that particular program is going to work in another location, because the things that can cause harm in one location may not be present in another location, or they may not be present in the same way in another location. The conditions typically differ. So it's important that safety programs must be site-specific. This is our 7th principle. And finally, the 8th principle says safety is good business. To reduce workplace injuries and illnesses, it's important that the organization and everyone, all stakeholders within an organization, realizes that it makes sense to be safety conscious. It makes sense to actually take care of the environment. Even though it may look like an expense, it is not. Effective workplace safety is not an expense, it is an asset. So there you have the 8 principles of a safe workplace. Understanding the definition of certain concepts in safety, health, and environment is very critical, because you need to be able to communicate effectively as a safety professional. In lesson 4, we will be discussing some definitions that are fundamental to the practice of health, safety, and environment. Basic definitions, lesson 4. In this lesson, we'll be considering key terms and terminologies in health, safety, and environment. And this is important because it's critical that appropriate vocabulary is used when discussing safety issues. And it's also important that the appropriate meaning of terms are known by safety professionals when in discussions, when looking at documentation, and when communicating with team members. So we'll look at some definitions that as a safety professional, you must be conversant with, and you must be able to interpret them correctly when they are being used. The first of these is hazard. Hazard is a source, situation, or act with potential harm in terms of human injury or ill health. This means that a hazard is anything. It could be an object, it could be a work process, it could be a situation, it could be a condition that has the potential to cause harm. It may not have caused the harm, but there is the possibility that it would cause harm. This is considered a hazard. When you look at this critically, you can say practically everything can be a hazard. So if everything is a hazard because it has a potential to cause harm, one would wonder, where does that leave us? If, for instance, the chemical I use in the office is a hazard because it has the potential. The chair I'm sitting on is a hazard because it has the potential. Climbing down the stairs is a hazard because it has the potential, and so on and so forth. Where does that leave us? Yes, these things have the potential, but they do not necessarily have to cause harm. And that's where risk comes in. The second definition is risk. Risk is the measure of the likelihood of a hazard causing harm and the severity of the harm that that hazard will cause. That is what risk is. The measure of the likelihood of the hazard causing harm and the severity or impact of that hazard. And that's why we have risk defined here as severity times frequency, which is likelihood, times exposure, because the exposure is also a measure of how open or how vulnerable the worker is to this hazard. So these 3 elements constitute or make up that measure of how hazards can cause harm, or the measure of the harm a hazard can cause. That is the severity or impact, the frequency or probability, and the exposure. Then we have accident. Accident is an undesired event resulting in death, injury, damage to health, damage to property, or other form of loss. The key defining thing about an accident is that it results in loss, as against the generic term called incident. Incident is used generically for those events that do not cause harm, but which might have done so under different circumstances. In some cases, you will find incident being used as a generic term to cover accident, near miss, or dangerous occurrence. So any kind of event that was not anticipated and that is unplanned for is considered an incident. So accident in some cases may also be categorized under incident. However, in clear terms, incident means no harm was caused. Accident means there was harm and there was some form of loss. Another term you should be conversant with is near miss. Near miss is an unplanned event with the potential to result in a loss. One way to look at a near miss is that all the circumstances for the accident to occur were actually present, but somehow we missed having an accident. So that is a near miss, meaning all of the circumstances were there, the event probably even occurred, or some aspect of the event occurred, but then it did not cause harm, or it did not go through to that point where harm was caused. So we can see that this could have happened. We can see that there could have been a loss here. We can see that this was a narrow escape, so to say. That is a near miss. And it's important that all of these are captured within the safety program to ensure that such incidents and processes are put in place to ensure that such things are avoided in future. So we have controlled risk, a portion of the risk that can be managed with existing controls. Later on, we'll also talk about control. There's dangerous occurrence, which is a near miss with serious injury potential. So this, as it were, is a higher category of a near miss. Why? Because of the severity of what could have happened if indeed the event caused an injury. Acute effects, very important. Effects that are caused by a single exposure with short-term impact. They are reversible effects. So usually when workers are exposed to toxics or things that cause harm, acute effects are single exposure, they're short-term, and the effect on the body is reversible. So there's some elements, some chemicals that cause acute effects or acute injury, if you like. Then there's chronic effects, effects caused by prolonged exposure. These are irreversible effects of exposure. These two definitions are important because it's important for the safety professional to know the effects, different effects that different substances have on the body in order to know how to control them. And then there's personal protective equipment, very popular. These include items that are worn on the body to protect the body from hazards. Things like safety helmets, safety shoes, hand gloves, coveralls, goggles, and so on and so forth are personal protective equipment. They also come in under some of the items that, or some of the processes or controls that are utilized in safety against hazards in the workplace. And then we have some other definitions, particularly dealing with the environment. We have environmental aspect. Environmental aspect is the element of an organization's activities that can interact with the environment. Meaning, what are the things you do that have impact or that have the potential to impact on the environment? All of these are considered environmental aspect. So peradventure, you carry out manufacturing and there's waste generated. That is considered environmental aspect. As it is, it has not impacted, but it has the potential. Those waste generated are considered environmental aspect. The process that generates the waste is considered an environmental aspect. Then there's environmental impact. Any change to an environment which is adverse, which may be adverse or beneficial, is an environmental impact. Environmental monitoring is a collection of physical samples and data used to study the response of the environment to the activities in the worksite. And environmental protection is safeguarding the surroundings in which an organization operates, including the air, water, land, and natural resources. And finally, pollution is any emission or substance that causes fouling or contamination or destruction of ground air or water resources. Without a doubt, risk assessment is the fulcrum on which HSE management rests on. Risk assessment is the center of health, safety, and environment. Whatever it is we're going to do as far as managing safety is all about, it starts and ends with risk assessment. So risk assessment is so critical to understanding how to manage HSE. In this lesson 5, we'll be discussing how to go about conducting risk assessment. Lesson 5, overview of risk assessment. Earlier on in lesson 4, we had defined hazards and risks. And I said that risk is the measure of the likelihood and the impact of a hazard causing harm, meaning that when we have hazards in the workplace, it is important to be able to assess the measure of risk that these hazards can pose. And risk assessment is the foundation of ensuring safety and health in the workplace. It's important that safety practitioners, professionals, and even everyone in the organization understands the concept of risk assessment and understands the process of carrying out risk assessment. And that's what we will be doing in this lesson. Hazards, as we had earlier defined, is a source, situation, or act with potential harm in terms of human injury or ill health. Workplace hazards can come from a wide range of sources, like substances, materials, processes, or practices, and these have the ability to cause harm or adverse health effects to a person under certain conditions. Basically, a hazard can cause harm or adverse effects to individuals as health effects or to organizations as property or equipment losses. Risks. Risk, again, as earlier said, consists of severity, frequency, and exposure, and we had said that it is the measure of how much harm and how likely it is that a hazard can cause harm, which is the likelihood of a hazard to cause harm and the severity of the harm that may be caused. determines the risk one is exposed to by the hazard. Workplace hazards can come from a range of sources, and we've also mentioned some of those examples. The likelihood of the hazard to cause harm and the severity of the harm that may be caused is what determines the risk, as also earlier said. And this is why it is important for the safety practitioner to be able to assess the risk posed by any hazard in the workplace. There's no more important skill to the safety professional than the ability to discover and remedy hazards before they can injure workers. So what exactly is risk assessment? Risk assessment is the basis, the fulcrum on which effective occupational safety and health management rests. Risk assessment is a term used to describe the overall process or method where the assessor identifies hazards and risks. So that's the first step, identification of hazards and risk factors that have the potential to cause harm, which we call hazard identification. Then analyzing and evaluating the risk associated with that hazard, which is risk analysis and risk evaluation. And then determining appropriate ways to eliminate the hazard or control the risk when the hazard cannot be eliminated, and that is known as risk control. So essentially, risk assessment has to do with identification, analysis, evaluation, and then control. A risk assessment is a thorough look at the workplace to identify those things, situations, processes, etc. that may cause harm, particularly to people. And after identification is made, then you would need to analyze and evaluate how likely and severe the risk is. Typically, tools like a risk matrix is used at this point, or a probability and impact matrix is used to do the analysis, and there are a number of other tools also that are used that you'll get to know in further levels of this course. So after identification is made and analysis and evaluation of how likely and severe the risk is done, when this determination is made, then you can next decide what measures should be in place to effectively eliminate or control the harm from happening. And also in controlling the harm, several tools are used. One of the key tools which we'll discuss in this class or in this lesson is the hierarchy of controls. It is a concept that is used to determine how to control risks that have been analyzed and evaluated. The aim of the risk assessment process is to evaluate hazards, then remove the hazard or minimize the level of its risk by adding control measures as necessary. By doing so, one would have created a safer and healthier workplace. So these, again, are the key terms in risk assessment. There's the risk assessment itself, which is the overall process of hazard identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. Then there's hazard identification, which is the process of finding, listing, and characterizing hazards. Remember, hazards are things that have the potential to cause harm in the workplace or anywhere where you may have operation or projects. Risk analysis, on the other hand, is a process for comprehending the nature of hazards and determining the level of risks. Note that risk analysis provides a basis for going on to risk evaluation and making decisions about risk control. Information can include current and historical data. Information to help you carry out risk analysis can include current and historical data, theoretical analysis, informed opinion, and also concerns of stakeholders. All of these come in to help you to determine and to analyze the risk. And then risk analysis also includes risk estimation. Then there's risk evaluation. In risk evaluation, you compare estimated risk against the given risk criteria to determine the significance of the risk. And finally, risk control. Risk control includes actions implementing risk evaluation decisions. The hierarchy of control, as earlier mentioned, is an approach that has proven to be very effective in implementing control of risks. And in the next lesson, we will be examining hierarchy of controls. In lesson 5, we started our discussion on risk assessment. We're going to follow up that with our discussion in lesson 6 on hierarchy of controls. After you must have identified the risks and analyzed them, it's so important that you then find a way to control these risks. And that's what you do with your hierarchy of controls. And that's what lesson 6 is all about. So lesson 6, here we go. Hierarchy of controls. So in lesson 5, we discussed about risk assessment, where I told you that the process of risk assessment includes hazard identification, analysis of the risk, which essentially means you're trying to figure out what the probability of the hazard causing harm is and the severity of the harm that the hazard will cause based on the exposure of the worker to this harm. Now, we had said that you analyze, you evaluate, and then you look at controls. So in lesson 6, we want to consider a key approach to ensuring that risks or hazards are controlled in the workplace. And this is called the hierarchy of controls. It is a systematic approach to managing hazards by implementing controls for identified and prioritized risks, starting from the most effective controls implementable to the least effective. So the idea of the hierarchy suggests that there are some controls that are more desirable and more effective than other controls. In this diagram, you see that there are 5 levels of controls, starting from the most desirable and most effective at the top to the least desirable or least effective at the bottom. So once risks have been prioritized by the process of assessment, that is the analysis and the evaluation, and you have come to the ranking of the risks that are in the workplace. So peradventure, you have 10, you have 20 risks that have been prioritized from the ones that are most significant, meaning based on their frequency and their impact or severity and probability, like we've said. Then you want to consider how are you going to control these risks. And when we talk about control, you are considering how do you find a way to ensure that these risks, that these hazards do not harm the worker, that they do not constitute harm or injury to the worker. So what you do is, first and foremost, you check, can we eliminate the risk? Can we find a way to remove that hazard from the workplace. So for instance, if it were to be a chemical that is being used in the workplace, and that chemical has the potential to harm, probably by releasing fumes that are harmful, or probably the chemical is corrosive and it can hurt the handlers of the chemical, then can you eliminate it? Meaning, can you eliminate that process of using chemicals? We don't even want to use the chemical at all. So that is the most desirable control. That's the first and most desirable. Can we do without the use of chemicals? All right. And then if that is not possible, that means something has to be used. Probably it's a cleaning agent and it has to be used. Then the second question is, can we substitute it? And so you find that the idea of elimination and substitution, in some texts, you will find that they are considered one and the same. That is elimination or substitution. Because the second thing will be, can we substitute that chemical using something that is less harmful? Another chemical that is less harmful can be used. So in this way, you're eliminating the original chemical and then substituting with another one. So that's why elimination and substitution at times we consider it as one and the same. So that's the most desirable and the most effective control. Can we remove the chemical? We're not using it again. Once the chemical has been removed, then there is no danger to the worker anymore. But work needs to go on. Work needs to be carried on. So we will find a lot of times that we cannot eliminate the use of the chemical. So we can then decide to substitute it with a chemical that's probably more friendly. Maybe in some instances when we're considering the environment, we're eliminating one chemical and substituting with another one that is more environmentally friendly. So that's substitution, or one that is milder and will not cause the kind of harm that this initial one is causing. So that's elimination or substitution. And that's the most effective, because once that is done, then the hazard is removed. But a lot of times that may not be possible or doable, or the substitute may not be available. And because work still needs to go on, then we consider engineering controls. Engineering controls typically includes adopting processes to find a way to engineer the hazard away from the worker, typically putting some sort of blockade or control between the worker and the hazard. An example in terms of the chemical could be that if it is the fumes of the chemical that are harmful to the worker, we can decide to include or introduce ventilation into the environment, so that even though the chemical is still being used and it is releasing fumes, engineering controls come in and ventilators are then put in place to ensure that the fumes do not accumulate and harm the worker. While this does not eliminate or substitute or totally remove the hazard, it at least puts a barrier between the worker and the hazard. And typically that is how engineering control works, especially in this example of a harmful chemical. Now, if this is also not possible, possibly by reason of the work or even as an addition. So another thought is that once you're not able to eliminate or substitute, you can then look at engineering controls. Remember, it's an hierarchy. And while engineering controls may actually get some level of control, it may not get all of the level of control that is desired. So you can still look at administrative controls, which is the next best thing to engineering controls. And administrative controls essentially includes work procedures, methods, training, and generally behavioral controls. Meaning at this stage, we then begin to look at how can the worker behave in such a way that the worker will not have contact with the hazard. So in this case, we may have things like worker rotation, or training for the worker to ensure that the worker knows how to handle the chemical without getting in contact with the skin and all of that. Or you may have a scenario where the worker also is given instructions on how to handle the material, and that's where we talk about certain instructions that are contained in safety data sheets and all of those kind of controls. You may also have scenarios where you are talking about training the worker to have understanding of how to behave in the particular environment where the chemical is being used, and so on and so forth. So this is administrative controls are all about behavioral controls. They're all about work methods and any other controls that have to do with the behavior of the worker and how the worker can ensure that they are not particularly impacted by the hazard. But note that in this case, the hazard has not been eliminated. There's not been any block or blockade between the worker and the hazard. The hazard is still there. Now you are trying to find a way to control the behavior of the worker to ensure that they do not interact with the hazard in a way that it will harm them. And then finally, it's personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is considered as the least effective. Why? Because the hazard is still there. It's not been eliminated. There's not been any blocker or anything separating the hazard from the worker. However, what has happened is that you have given the worker some personal item to wear on his or her body to ensure that they are now protected from the hazard that is already there and that is still there. Okay, so in this case, they may wear a nose mask or a goggle or a face mask or a helmet or overalls, and all of these are aimed at ensuring that the hazard that is still present does not get to the worker. But the idea is that in any situation, when there's a hazard to be dealt with, you look at elimination first and then substitution and then engineering controls. If the hazard or the risk is still considered high, then you look at further controls with administrative controls and then PPEs. At no point should you as a safety practitioner just go straight and implement PPEs. Okay, PPE is the last resort. You want to find a way to look at the higher ranking controls in the hierarchy because they are more effective. You look at them first, and then if you do not have any other choice, you then can look at PPEs. Typically, you would find though that in work environments, PPEs are like a standard because having done all of the substitution and engineering controls, it still makes sense to have that last line of defense, even though it should never be your first and only option to controlling risks or hazards in the workplace. In lessons 7 and 8, which will be the concluding lessons for this course, we will be looking at HSE regulations and also HSE roles and responsibilities in the workplace. HSE regulations are very important because regulations essentially guide the practice of HSE, and these regulations, even though they differ from country to country, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, they're essentially based on the same principles which we've discussed up until this point in this course. And then we'll be looking at roles and responsibilities. What are the roles and responsibilities for HSE in the workplace? These are the two topics that we'll be looking at in lessons 7 and 8, and then we will wrap up the course. Lesson 7. Safety regulations. Oftentimes, introduction of new regulations or improvements on existing ones are prompted by accidents that have had significant impact. The number of accidents probably will come to mind. Regulations are formulated based on assessment of risks in specific environments, and regulations for safety is typically country-specific. Of course, that makes sense because countries have different peculiarities. So the regulations generally will be peculiar to the specific country or even specific industry within the country or specific localities. However, the International Labour Organization, which is a part of the United Nations, issues standards, resolutions, and codes for global use as far as safety matters are concerned. So let's have a look at regulations across the globe. Even though what we'll quickly realize is that the principles guiding regulations all over the world are practically the same, but there may be specific or peculiarities to regulations depending on the jurisdiction within which you operate. As stated earlier on, different countries have their own occupational safety and health and environment regulations that guide operations within their regions. Typically, you would find that these regulators are within the Ministry of Labour within those countries. And the reason is also a bit straightforward, and that is because the focus of occupational safety and health regulations and the focus of occupational safety and health efforts is about people, the safety, the health, the promotion of such, and the preservation and protection of people. The guiding principles are, however, the same as earlier stated, and the laws are practically the same. The International Labour Organization, ILO, is the body that advocates for and promotes safety and health of workers in the workplace globally. The ILO places special importance on developing and applying a preventative safety and health culture in workplaces worldwide. In 2003, the ILO began to observe World Day for Safety, stressing the prevention of illness and accidents at work on every 28th of April. One of the key functions of the International Labour Organization from its inception has been the establishment of international standards on labour and social matters. These international labour standards take the form of conventions and recommendations, and they have about 70 of them that deal with occupational safety and health matters. Also, the ILO provides guidance in the form of codes and practices and manuals, which are used as reference materials by those in charge of formulating detailed regulations or responsible for occupational safety and health in different countries. In some cases, other instruments like resolutions have been introduced to address particular safety problems. Different countries have their own occupational safety and health regulations that guide operations within their regions. A number of countries have also adopted some of the resolutions and recommendations, and they're signatory to some of these resolutions and recommendations from ILO. So they adopt them and then they domicile them in their own countries. Let's have a look at some of the regulations in some of these countries. While we will not take an in-depth look at regulations per se, that is an aspect that we look at in the level 3 of this program. What we'll do will just be to look at the structure of regulatory or regulations in these countries. In the United States, the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 created both the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. OSHA, in the U.S. Department of Labor, is responsible for developing and enforcing workplace safety and health regulations, while NIOSH, which is in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, is focused on research, information, education, and training in occupational safety and health. OSHA has been regulating occupational safety and health since 1971, and occupational safety and health regulation of a limited number of specifically defined industries was in place for several decades before 1971, and broad regulations by some individual states was in place for many years prior to the establishment of OSHA. But OSHA serves as that overall body across the US that is responsible for enforcing the Act, that is the OSHA Act. In the United Kingdom, health and safety legislation is drawn up and enforced by the Health and Safety Executive and local authorities under the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. Increasingly, however, in the UK, the regulatory trend is moving away from prescriptive rules and towards risk assessment. It's interesting to note that in the OSHA, that is the American Occupational Safety and Health Act, there is a clause called the General Duty Clause, which also is really based on the concept of risk assessment, which, as stated here, the UK has also moved away from prescriptive laws, as stated in the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act, to more of risk assessment, meaning that governments also realize that regulations can only go so far. So it is imperative on organizations to do a risk assessment, assess the risks that are inherent in their operations, and then determine the controls and ensure that those controls are implemented in order to protect the worker. So the General Duty Clause in OSHA also requires employers to ensure they protect employees from anything that may be in the organization that may harm employees in their workplace. And that is the idea of a movement, and that is how it is globally as well, a movement from prescriptive laws to risk assessment. In Canada, workers are covered by provincial or federal labor codes, depending on the sector in which they work. Workers covered by federal legislation, including those in mining, transportation, and federal employment, are covered by the Canada Labour Code. All other workers are covered by the health and safety legislation of the province they work in. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, COSH, an agency of the government of Canada, was created in 1978 by an act of parliament. COSH in Canada is mandated to promote safe and healthy workplaces to help prevent work-related injuries and illnesses. And then in Malaysia, the Department of Occupational Safety and Health, DOSH, under the Human Resource Ministry, is responsible to ensure that the safety, health, and welfare of workers in both the public and private sector is upheld. DOSH is responsible to enforce the Factory and Machinery Act of 1969, as well as the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1994. All of these are the regulatory structures that are in place in some of these countries. In Nigeria, Nigeria is guided by the Factories Act of 1990. This Nigerian law makes general and special provisions for the health, safety, and welfare of persons employed in places statutorily defined as factories, and for which a certificate of registration is required by law. It makes general provisions as to the standards of cleanliness, crowding, ventilation, lighting, drainage of floors and sanitary conveniences, etc. All factories must have potable water and washing facilities, as an example. Of course, these are all prescriptive. And as earlier stated, countries are moving away from prescriptive regulations to more of risk assessment. And Nigeria also is attempting to move away from that. There is a proposed OSH bill which establishes the National Council for Occupational Safety and Health, which is to repeal the Factories Act and make comprehensive provisions for occupational safety and health in workplaces. This proposed Occupational Safety and Health bill is broader and takes into consideration the recent thinking of moving from prescriptive regulations to risk assessment into consideration. For instance, when one looks at this new law, it prescribes that every employer who regularly has more than 10 employees in any workplace shall establish an Occupational Safety and Health Committee of no less than 3 members to form a Safety and Health Committee, who will then be responsible for carrying out risk assessment at least every 3 months and submitting a report to the Council. This committee is also meant to have responsibility of investigating accidents and reporting the same. The law prescribes that in a scenario where employees have less than 10, or when employers have less than 10 employees, then the employer shall have one person designated as a safety representative. This is the structure in Nigeria. In Nigeria, for instance, there are other related laws, as it is with other countries as well, that also have provision to regulate other aspects of business that are safety related or impact on the environment. So in Nigeria, there's the Mineral Oil Regulation, there's the Oil Pipelines Act, there's Petroleum Drilling and Productions Regulation, there's Petroleum Refining Regulation. All of these are safety related or environment related. There's Dock Safety of Labor Regulation, Road Traffic Regulations, Shipping and Navigation Regulations, Office Shops and Railways Premises Act, Electricity Regulations, as well as the Workmen's Compensation Act. All of these are regulations that the safety professional should be conversant with in order to be able to appropriately manage safety in the workplace. So congrats, you are on the last lesson for this course, HSE Roles and Responsibilities, Lesson 8. Note that safety is everyone's responsibility. So in an organization, every single person has a responsibility towards safety. While there may be designated persons assigned to certain roles for safety in the organization, each person is first and foremost responsible for their own safety, and then they must also ensure that they do not endanger other workers. And in addition to that, we would also then look at what are the roles and responsibilities as far as safety is concerned to all of people in any organization. So starting from the chief executive or the board chairman to the last person and the newest person in the organization, everybody has individual safety and health responsibilities. Health and safety, of course, is the joint responsibility of management and workers. Management is accountable for non-compliance to health and safety legislation. Individual responsibilities, of course, apply to every employee in the workplace, including the chief executive officer. So to fulfill the responsibilities, however, for people, anyone in the workplace to fulfill their responsibilities, it is important that people have knowledge of these responsibilities, meaning management must communicate the responsibilities to everyone. Then there has to be sufficient authority to carry out the responsibility, meaning the organization must be structured in such a way that people are empowered to be able to carry out their responsibilities, whether it is for them to adhere to certain procedures and processes or for them to enforce it or have other people do those things. It's important that the authority is made available or they are given sufficient authority. Then people also, workers in the organization, must also have the required ability and competence. This underscores the need for training and or certification as required within the organization to ensure that people have the competence to carry out the responsibilities that have been assigned to them. Let's look at some examples of responsibilities for management. Now, management is expected to provide a safe and healthy workplace, establish and maintain a health and safety program. Later on in level 2, we will discuss the approach to managing safety, and we'll find out that it is about establishing a safety program, a defined plan of action to managing safety. And that's one of the responsibilities of management, that there must be the establishment and maintenance of a health and safety program. Ensuring workers are trained or certified as required. This is also one of the responsibilities of management. Management should also be responsible for reporting accidents and cases of occupational diseases to the appropriate authority. They should provide medical and first aid facilities, ensure personal protective equipment is available for all workers, provide workers with health and safety information, support supervisors in their health and safety activities, and evaluate health and safety performance of supervisors. All these responsibilities I've just listed are some of the responsibilities that management should take up in an organization to ensure that safety works. Also, there are responsibilities for first-line supervisors. I should mention that when we say management, we mean the chief executive as well as managers. Now, examples of responsibilities of first-line supervisors include instructing workers to follow safe work practices. Note here that you would find that the real responsibility for implementing safety in any organization should be the responsibility of the first-line supervisors, not the safety coordinator or advisors. The safety coordinators or advisors are to advise and to give support, because the first-line supervisors are the ones that are actually in touch with the workers, and they are the first line of contact, and they're the ones really doing the work that consists of the hazards as mentioned earlier on. It's important that they are the people saddled with the responsibility for actually implementing the safe work practices, the safety procedures, the safety rules and regulations in the workplace. So they are to enforce health and safety regulations, correct unsafe acts and unsafe conditions, ensure that only authorized, adequately trained workers operate equipment, report and investigate all accidents and incidents appropriately, inspect their own area and taking remedial action to minimize or eliminate hazards, ensure equipment is properly maintained, and then promoting safety awareness in the workplace. Workers themselves, when we say workers, we mean people that are not supervising anyone. They are being supervised. So workers also have responsibilities to use their personal protection and safety equipment as required by the employer. They have responsibility to follow safe work procedures, know and comply with all regulations, report any injury or illness immediately, report on safe acts and unsafe conditions, and participate in joint health and safety committees. Then there are responsibilities for the safety coordinators or safety advisors, who we may call the safety professionals within an organization. And we'll find that their responsibilities include advising all employees on health and safety matters, coordinating interdepartmental health and safety activities, including meetings and so on and so forth. Collecting and analyzing health and safety statistics is also one of the responsibilities of the safety coordinator or safety manager or safety supervisor. Then providing health and safety training, as I mentioned earlier when we were discussing the principles, I talked about training and that it is a key part of the work of the health and safety professional. Conducting research on special problems, also attending health and safety committee meetings as a resource person are part of the responsibility of the safety coordinator. And finally, a safety committee. You would recall that when we talked about regulations and when we were examining Nigeria's regulation, especially as it pertains to the Occupational Safety and Health Bill that is being proposed, there was a mention of safety and health committees to be set up and that are to conduct audits. In this case, you expect also that organizations would have safety and health committees, and their role really is to be a link between the workers or the employees and the employers and to foster a safety culture within the organization. The purpose of the Workplace Health and Safety Committee, as I said, is to have an effective safety program that ensures that everything that is in that safety program actually covers all of the stakeholders and that there is representation for everyone. An effective safety program needs the cooperative involvement of all employees. An Occupational Health and Safety Committee is a forum for cooperative involvement of employees representing both labor and management. Such committees are statutory requirements for organizations of a specified minimum size in most jurisdictions, as we saw in the new Nigerian law, and the responsibilities of members are generally spelled out in the health and safety legislation. And these responsibilities essentially involve promoting safety culture, promoting cooperation within the organization so that health and safety management will flourish and people will be safe from harm and injuries.